Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the How Economic Developers Are Thinking About the Future and Visioning webinar, the first of IEDC's 5-part webinar series, Future Ready Economic Development Organizations. I'm Rick Weddle, President and CEO of the Hampton Roads Economic Development Alliance, and this year's chair of IEDC's think tank, EDRP. I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Also joining us today are two experts who will share their insight into how economic developers are visioning and planning for the future. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few housekeeping notes from IEDC. Please note that all attendees will be muted during the webinar. To ask a question of the speakers, please type your questions into the question box. During the Q&A period at the end of the session, I will pose your questions to the panelists. Within 24 hours of today's webinar, an evaluation will be emailed to you by IEDC. Please complete the evaluation, as we do use the feedback to improve our web seminars. At the end of this evaluation, you will receive a link to download today's presentation. You will also receive a link to download your free copy of the EDRP report at the end of the survey. First, I'd like to kick off today's presentation with a brief overview of the EDRP paper that this series is based on, Future Ready, Preparing for Tomorrow's Economy. The report looks at things that economic developers should be thinking about over the next 10 years. And it offers some practical resources on how to go about doing that. So what can economic developers do to better prepare their organizations and their communities for the future? The word cloud you see illustrates the complexity and the challenges we face. Technology is advancing at an unprecedented level. Technology advancement is not only disrupting entire industries, it's changing the way we work. And it will impact economic development in the long term. And that change is happening faster and faster. Accelerating pace of technological advancement will impact the environment in which economic developers operate, as well as the larger global framework in which our communities exist. We need to be better prepared to guide our communities in the future where the pace of change will be much faster. Economic development staff needs to be able to both understand and speak technology. The report introduces the term the jargon economy to highlight all the new ED-related buzzwords. Staff will need to know what cutting-edge technology looks like. They need to ask to be shown it. Staff will have to keep abreast of broad enabling technologies rather than just second-guessing where markets might go. The most striking finding of research, and this is very striking, is just how little economic development organizations do for strategic thinking about long-term future, how little they pay attention to the future. And so the research team wanted to develop a framework that EDOs can use to at least start the conversation, both at the organization level and the community level. We developed the Future Ready framework, or really a mental model, if you will, to think about this. It attempts to outline key issues that are likely to be of relevance to EDOs in the coming years, and the different levels of which they can address these issues. Accompanying the framework in the report is a questions-based guide that can serve as a starting point for the conversation about the future of a community or an economic development organization. The three concentric circles in the diagram on the framework represent the different levels of control and influence that we have. Control is the dark-shaded innermost circle. It's the economic development organization. The influence area is the middle circle, and it's the community in which the EDO's sphere of influence exists. The outer circle largely is awareness. The outermost circle represents the larger national and international forces at play. EDOs can, depending on the resources and their inclination, use this framework to structure major research or just chat with a flip chart. Today we will hear two examples of how communities are thinking about the future, different approaches that each one is taking, and what are the pros and cons of each approach. Before we get to the speaker presentations, a little bit more about the report, and of which you'll be receiving a copy as a part of your registration for this webinar. The table on the screen now outlines the big projected growth areas in absolute or real terms, the growth of at least 1 million jobs. These are the sectors that the report largely focuses on. It's important to note that this is usually not the areas that economic developers traditionally focus. These jobs now typically offer low pay and generally unappealing work conditions. The report does look at how pay and conditions might be improved also, but it shows economic developers need to begin thinking about this business of growth in a new and different way. Automation impacts will be felt across most of the economy. The Bureau of Labor Statistics figures don't examine innovation, and so they may offer an overly rosy picture of future job growth. This table, this automation table, shows some very high-profile studies that have shown how certain tasks and certain jobs might be lost to automation. The accounts typically stress that there are several reasons why automation might not necessarily occur in every instance where it's technically possible. It could be the cost of development and deployment, supply and demand of labor, economic benefits of automation, regulatory and social acceptance. But it's important to note in these two studies, between almost half to 60% of occupations could be at risk over the next many years. Of course, there are also jobs that will be created by those who design these automation systems, and cities like Pittsburgh and Boston have currently figured prominently in the field of robotics. The next few slides will feature some of the examples and some of the sectors that are covered in the report. Trucking will be one of the most significant areas to be impacted by automation. In October of 2016, Anheuser-Busch hauled a trailer loaded with beer 120 miles in an autonomous drive truck, completing what's believed to be the first commercial shipment by a self-driving vehicle. Encouraging people to undertake training in sectors with high projected automation is likely to be a big challenge for economic developers. It's a problem for such a sector such as trucking that currently have high skill shortages or not enough workers. We're also seeing food delivery as an area of rampant and rapid automation. The slide shows a combination of order-taking kiosks, of robot baristas, and drone delivery of pizza. And if any of you have been to one of the Amazon Go stores, you'll know how automated it's becoming in real time. Retail overall is becoming very automated, or roboticized, if we might say. The images in this slide, clockwise from the top left, show robotic warehousing, robotic information delivery, robotic floor cleaning, and robotic shelf scanning. Not very many employees in those pictures. This next slide is a part of the city of San Francisco's support for the gig economy, essentially the self-employed in their many and varied forms. In 2016 research by the National Bureau of Economic Research, it found that the contingent workforce had increased from 10% of total workforce in 2005 to roughly 15% in 2015, or a 50% increase. Such work can be an end in itself and a means. Gig work can be a route back into work, but it could also be a way for workers to temporarily fund their goals, whether it's launching a business or paying for their college. The City of San Francisco's Office of Economic and Workforce Development strategy centers upon a business portal page that lays out the requirements to operate in the city and points freelancers to various resources that can help them prepare for healthcare or retirement. Online training developed in partnership with a nonprofit focused on services to the gig worker community. It integrates gig workers into wider training and employment opportunities, a very innovative way of responding in very real time. Obviously, all of this change will affect training. And there's some good examples of practice around the country in training. For example, e-commerce is creating logistics jobs in new locations. But we wonder, what does cutting-edge logistics training look like? The Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania happens to be a boom area for retail logistics, and it has really exciting facility that helps train the workers. The Lehigh Career Technical Institute has its own supply chain and logistics program, supplying 9 local schools. They teach 90 students at a time warehousing, inventory control, picking and packing, and forklift operations from their 17,000-foot distribution center. Access to high-capacity fiber networks will be essential for many types of industries in the future. Examples include companies dealing with big data and fintech and autonomous vehicles. Cleveland, for example, has a 100-gig network, unusually large, but very important in helping attract or support big data companies. Economic developers are well served to partner with other experts, such as land use planners and transport planners, to determine how high-capacity fiber networks will be laid to ensure business has easy access. A more everyday challenge is making 5G widely available. Key here is a good small cell coverage that allows for 5G signals to be extended down from large macro cell towers to the street level. These small cells, roughly the size of a pizza box, are set on the top of a light pole or a telephone pole in a community, and really opens up a significant opportunity. So now I'd like to turn and introduce today's speakers, beginning with Gerald Gordon, the President and CEO of the Economic Development Authority in Fairfax County, Virginia, the second largest suburban office market in the nation and the largest in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Jerry's been with FCEDA since the late 1983. He's taught at Catholic University, University of Maryland, George Mason University, the Virginia Commonwealth University. He's consulted with city and state governments throughout the United States and around the world, as well as the governments of Poland, the island of Vizcaya, Puerto Rico, and in Micronesia. In the last decade, Dr. Gordon has chaired the board's Fairfax Symphony, the Arts Council of Fairfax County, the Foundation for Fairfax County Public Schools, and George Mason University Honors College. He's a member of the on the board of the International Economic Development Council, and a fellow member and honorary life member of the organization. Welcome, Jerry.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go through a number of slides, and you will see the points that I'm intending to cover. They are similar to what you'll see on the slides, and I've attacked this essentially in the same way that the questions were posed, and so I think you'll follow along pretty easily. I'm looking for the advance the slide button. Anybody want to? Let's see.
Should be down in the lower left-hand corner, Jerry, if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you, but I'm not seeing it.
Put your cursor over it.
Oh, that little arrow?
Little arrow right there.
There we go. All right. Sorry for that delay. That's a very faint. All right. Some of the future issues that I think we're going to confront and that I've started to confront will be redundant from what Rick covered, but not all of it. Just to emphasize something that he said, about 2 years ago, I walked through a plant in Germany that was manufacturing automobiles. And you can walk up and down the aisles, and there are 26 aisles across, and you can walk up and down, start with a piece of sheet metal, and watch every bit of this process until you emerge at the last station with a new car. There were 6 people working in that facility. So there are clearly changes in the workforce and the requirements for workforce in the future. What the takeaway I had from that was, you don't want to be a worker in the factory, you want to be the guy designing the robotics that went into manufacturing those cars. But here's the real issue, it seems to me. We can see some of the nascent technology, new technologies that are emerging, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, translational medicine, and more, but we don't know what we don't know. And 5 years ago, if you had talked about artificial intelligence and some of the Internet of Things that are happening now, no one would have imagined it before that. And I think that's where we're going, to an economy and technologies that nobody even can anticipate. So the question becomes, how do you plan for something for which you cannot anticipate? And there are already severe shortages of information technology workers today. In the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, we have about 200,000 vacancies, 20,000 vacancies in cybersecurity. And part of the problem is that children and students and even mid-career people aren't comfortable going into some of these areas. And part of the problem is that if they are willing to do so or interested in doing so and go on to community colleges or colleges to get the required, or elsewhere to get the required skill sets, there is a shortage of IT instructors because they can do so much better salary-wise in the business community. So it's very, very difficult to attack this issue. It's not a matter of attracting the workforce with those skill sets from other parts of the country, because nobody else has them either. So it's a great issue. Part of the issue remains, despite decades of working on this, part of the issue remains that young girls in grade school still don't, at least in our area, don't pursue STEM education or classes to the same extent as do boys. So there's a diminishing demand for lower skill set workers, and there's an increasing demand for workers with these extraordinarily high skill sets in information technology. It's not a good match. Let me see. I've just lost the page here. There we go. There are a number of other issues for the future for communities to plan. And this issue of globalism is really important because it affects not just areas like Fairfax County or Los Angeles. Excuse me, it affects everybody. We have seen the loss of entire industries, everything from timber to clothing articles, shoes, all these industries that were strong and which sustained steel, even parts of the oil production industry. We have seen those industries go without any real warning. And it could happen again. So the question becomes, which industries are now in jeopardy in our communities? But that can be a large community, it could be a small community, it can be a manufacturer who now all of a sudden has competition because of wage rates or tariffs. Becomes more difficult to produce at a profit. But the loss of world markets can be due to anything from political actions to simply lower wage rates, to tariffs, to concerns that local communities become very frustrated about because you cannot always see them happening, and there's nothing you really can do to avoid these. All right, so I'm going to run through a series of issues. There is competition for economic development to a greater extent than has ever been seen before. I've been in the field for 45 years, and I've been in my present job for 35. And I have never seen, either in the region, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, or in the Commonwealth of Virginia, or nationally, or internationally, the kinds of competition that we see now. It's increasing because local governments are in need of the funds that are required to support public services locally. So the need for creating jobs and generating tax revenues is even greater than ever before. The competition is driving an increase in the use of incentives for economic development, which implies that if you're capable of providing an incentive or a larger incentive than your competition, then you could be in a greater position to win that prospect than other communities that are not able to provide such large incentives. So the question that you see on the screen there bothers me a great deal. Will the have communities continue to grow and the have-nots get less, in which case you have a great disparity and very little in the middle in terms of communities. Here's a technology issue. As everyone knows, you don't have to be in Fairfax County to work in Fairfax County. A friend of mine was the head of the EDS operations here. He had 6,000 employees around the world. And he asked me one time, do you know how many employees I have? And I said, no, I don't, 6,000. Do you know where they are? And I said, no. And he said, neither do I. The point being that you can work anywhere around the world and work for companies doing work here in Fairfax County. So when that happens, for us in Virginia, for example, and many other communities around the country, we provide public services primarily on the back of real estate taxes. So 64% of our general fund expenditures are from the real estate tax base, and you only have residential and commercial components of that. Our raison d'etre is to raise the commercial side of that so that residents are paying proportionately less to provide public services. But what's happened in recent years is that employees, the average square footage per employee has declined dramatically. So when I first arrived in 1983 in my position, the average per employee square footage was 265 square feet. Well, now I hear 80 feet, 100 feet, maybe 120 or 40 feet, but nothing over that. So you have to bring in 2.5 times to 3 times as many workers into an office building in order to use up the same space. So that leads me to worry about institutions, and this is almost a side note, but it strikes me that institutions may be overbuilt. Hospitals, people don't stay in hospitals any longer. Universities, people don't always take classes in classrooms. They're doing them online. So that's an issue. What happens to communities whose public services are dependent upon the real estate tax base when these things happen and there's relatively less contributions? Plus, if people can indeed work from any place, what is going to bring them to your community? From us, these are the list of things that people have cited for us. Quality public education systems are are top of the list, and we're right adjacent to Washington D.C. So when I first came here, the first answer on that kind of a list was proximity to the federal government. Today it's in the top 3 always, but quality public schools has become first more frequently. Fair taxes, not no taxes, but fair taxes, because businesses are willing to pay their fair share if they think that they're going to get a fair in public services. Safe neighborhoods, we're fortunate to have the highest or the lowest violent crime rate in the country for any community over 100,000 people. That's really, really important, especially in a major metropolitan area. Quality of life, things to do, all those kinds of considerations are very important to businesses. So it comes down to this. There are only 2 ways you can attract or retain companies. Communities too often will pursue companies for which they do not have the correct assets or amenities. You can only pursue those business lines if you have the right assets that they require. Or the other option is to analyze the assets you do have and then ascertain which industry segments you want to pursue for which those assets are appropriate. And then there's a mixture of those two. Start building the assets you need while you're pursuing companies that need the assets you have. However, it's important to note that, as we said earlier, there's no real certainties about what the industries of the future are going to be. If we don't know what the industries of the future entirely are going to be, then it's hard to determine what assets they're going to require. The one thing I think is certain, the one thing I think is probably certain is that information technology skill sets are going to be very important. And so building up the workforce is very important. And I think that the community that builds up the workforce, the IT workforce with those skill sets, those are the communities that are going to win. So we look at the environments constantly, but it's become increasingly important to look beyond just local and regional environments when we're looking at how we can compete with others. National and global environments are increasingly important. And we have to look at all factors: technology, business, social, sociocultural, educational, and political, as distinct from regulatory. Two separate items, and I should have included regulatory on that list. But you have to consider competition both in the form of attracting businesses to your community and in terms of retaining them in the community from other communities trying to attract them. Because more and more, there are a lot of options for communities. Even the smallest and the most rural of communities, not just in Virginia, but across the country, because I've done some writing and I've talked to a lot of communities across the entire United States, several hundred. And modern technology for telecommunications is always at the top of their needs list. And it's the one thing that will retard the growth of small communities and rural communities. Workforce, we've already covered, and the quality of public education systems. So here's some lessons that we've all learned, but it bears repeating. Visioning has to be realistic. You have to know your assets and your limitations. I have seen a sign on a major interstate in this country that said, "Welcome to the technology capital of blank." And it was at least 150 miles from any major city. Businesses know what they need. You're calling it something else doesn't do a bit of good. You have to stay within yourself is the current phrase. You have to know what you have and pursue those that are, for whom those assets are appropriate. When you meet with community stakeholders, you don't talk, you gotta listen. You're not trying to sell them something. You're trying to get their buy-in to your planning. So when you're setting a vision, if they don't have that buy-in, if you don't have that buy-in from them, it's going to be very, very difficult. The one thing that we did in the early 80s that was really smart, and as economic development programs either begin to scale up or become more competitive, one of the things that needs to be done is to convince your local elected officials that economic development has a return on the investment, and that makes it an investment, not just a cost. Because too often communities will look at that expenditure every year and wonder why we're doing it. It is the exact opposite of a business whose board will look at a down sales when they're down and will spend more on advertising and promotion. Communities tend to do less because they have less to spend. So you have to convince them that this is indeed an investment. You have returns on the investment. And the second thing that we did was to convince them in terms not just of dollar returns or tax dollars, but in terms of what they're going to get back. Tax dollars converted into the number of school teachers, or the reducing the class size, or the number of fire stations or police stations. And then, of course, managing expectations, because you can overdo that. At one point, you can have you can convince people that you're going to get a return and they want it tomorrow. So you have to be careful to manage the expectations. I think this may be my last slide. In the future, economic development professionals will need to be absolutely conversant with all the technologies and all the changes in technologies that are emerging, which means if I'm correct that we don't know what we don't know and we don't know what's coming, then it's important to be conversant with the underlying technologies and skill sets that will lead us to those new emerging technologies. We have to not only understand global forces that will have an impact on us locally, but you'll have to see them coming, because once it hits you, it's too late. We have to be risk takers, which is difficult to sell locally, politically, but can be done. And we're salespeople, not just to businesses, but as I've mentioned, you really have to convince local stakeholders as well. And you have to understand how social media outlets can be used to maximum effect, because that's where a lot of the new business leaders are getting their information. And if you don't do it, then you're not only not getting your information out, they'll be wondering why you're not using those venues. And then, of course, we all have to be nimble, just because everything is changing. I believe that's it.
Okay, thank you so much, Jerry. That's very interesting, and I'm sure we'll get a host of questions. For our next speaker, I'd like to introduce Carolyn Hull, Vice President of Industry Cluster Development at LAEDC, the Los Angeles Economic Development Commission. Carolyn oversees strategies, programs, and staff to build capacity, export-oriented industries in which LA has a productive or a comparative advantage, such as aerospace, advanced transportation, biosciences, entertainment and digital media, trade and logistics. Previously at LAEDC, Ms. Hull was focused on partnering with the public sector, the county, plan and implement real estate and financing transactions that attract investment and retain and grow the Los Angeles County's employment base, including projects such as the Altacia Marine Research Park. Thanks for joining us today, Carolyn. Now I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Well, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. As indicated, I'm Carolyn Hull, and I'm going to be talking today about targeting industry clusters as an economic development strategy. Let me just make sure that I can control this. Bear with me for a moment. Okay, there we go. All right. So, by all measures, Los Angeles County is large. It's the most populous county in the nation, with 10 million residents in a land area over 4,000 square miles. It's home to a diverse and dynamic workforce of almost 4 million. However, we face challenges in preparing an educated and skilled workforce that is able to compete in the global marketplace, in allocating sufficient resources to maintain or deliver critically needed infrastructure projects under strained budgets, and in fostering a climate of technological innovation and product development, and in pursuing sustainable growth in the face of economic realities. Much of what I'm going to speak about today builds upon what the previous two speakers have already said, which is we are in a period of transition. And so how do we cope with this? To better focus and tailor our policies and programs, LAEDC has taken an industry cluster approach to economic development. The geographic clustering of industries enables firms to both compete and collaborate, increasing demand for supplier industries, encouraging the growth of specialized local infrastructure, developing a pool of specialized labor, and through rivalry and proximity, spurring innovation and new advancements. The map of the United States, as you're looking at, clearly shows that whether economic development practitioners acknowledge it or not, most regions and metropolitan statistical areas are already associated with specific industry clusters, and many are not surprising. New York City has financial services, Boston has biotechnology, Detroit auto parts and equipment, and apparently, and I found this to be the most surprising, the capital of golf equipment manufacturing is in Carlsbad, California. Trying to, oh, there we go. Our work at LAEDC focuses on building capacity in the traded industry clusters where the region has a competitive advantage. Traded industry clusters are those that compete to serve national and international markets versus local clusters, such as most retail. Currently, as you've heard, we are focused on really four industry clusters: advanced transportation, aerospace and defense, biosciences, and digital media and entertainment. LADC has developed a framework for industry cluster development where we leverage our research and analysis in those industries in which we have a productive advantages to inform strategic programs such as our industry councils, our foreign direct investment efforts through our World Trade Center, which is a subsidiary of LADC, and our Center for a Competitive Workforce, which I'm going to talk more about in a minute. This influences our transactional work, where we provide business and technical assistance to firms. LADC has a supplier matchmaking service to connect original equipment manufacturers, OEMs, with small businesses in aerospace and advanced transportation industries in Southern California. This is helping the region's OEMs add women-owned, veteran-owned, disadvantaged businesses and other small business categories to their supplier network. I just want to take a moment here and build upon what some of the other speakers have just said. In this industry cluster framework that I've outlined, we actually are focused in having our directors each be an industry expert. So we have a director of advanced transportation and aerospace and defense. We have a director of digital media and entertainment. We have someone who heads up our bioscience cluster. That way, when we go out and we work with our business assistance team, we are able to go in and talk in a language so that the industry can understand, so we can understand the industry needs from their perspective. Workforce development is a very important component of our framework for building capacity in the LA Basin. Like much of the rest of the United States, the LA Basin is transitioning in many significant ways, from an economy which has been characterized by labor being the primary factor of production to an information age, a digital economy, where intellectual property, capital, and knowledge are increasingly the primary factors. We're transitioning from traditional career paradigms to new work models, such as part-time work and self-employment in the so-called gig economy, and from traditional ways of doing business to a new technology-oriented workplace requiring vastly different skill sets and the types of thinking than in previous years. So in response to the growing concern about the fast transition economy and job markets, which are becoming increasingly more technical and specialized LA County's 19 community colleges have agreed to co-invest in the Center for a Competitive Workforce, which is housed at LADC. The center delivers on the vision of the statewide strong workforce program with new and better coordination by combining research on the supply of and demand for talent along with industry needs. The center is a partnership with LADC, the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce, and the Center of Excellence for Labor Market Research. It will look to create industry-driven education and workforce programs and curricula across our region's talent development systems, with the goal to train, educate, and upskill LA County's residents for the knowledge-intensive industries that will come to dominate our economic future. As you've just heard, many industries are being, and many occupations rather, are being impacted by automation. This way, with our center, we're going to be looking at how we can help balance the supply of skilled graduates with the projected hiring needs of local employers. The center, the center is actually, as I indicated, really based on analytics. The goal of the center produces ongoing regional economic outlook reports to better align the labor market supply and demand. The goal of our initial report was to pinpoint select target industries and middle skill occupations that will drive the regional economy, contributing to increased prosperity and improved standard of living for the residents in the economic region encompassed by Los Angeles and Orange County. Since the initial report was completed, we then go into what's called deeper dive. So we've just completed 2 deep dive reports, and I can send out to everyone. It's not here on our slides. There is a website, the Center for a Competitive Workforce, where you can go and actually download these reports, where we do deeper dives into specific industry clusters. We have completed our deeper dive into entertainment and digital media and the healthcare services. So when we did an analysis of our region, we presented the top 5 industries on the left-hand side. Those are the prominent industries with both large relative employment shares and a significantly large share of middle-scale occupations. We then projected those middle-scale job openings over a period ending in 2021. So in general, what we were trying to do is look at the analytics of where were overall strong job growth was going to happen in the LA Basin, but also really looking at where middle skill, and when we say middle skill, we mean entry-level jobs for which an associate's degree, some college or less education is sufficient to obtain that position. So we kind of started, and what's interesting about the chart on the left-hand side is that all our prominent industries have a location quotient that's significantly greater than 1. We also looked at emerging and growing industries, and those that are building capacity in the region. These can either be nascent industries, such as the autonomous vehicle industry, or existing industries that are in the midst of developing a cluster of activity in the LA Basin, such as the biomedical industry cluster. And as you can see there, we didn't list the actual location quotient. Many of these may have a location quotient that's less than 1. However, we can see that over the course of the next several years, we anticipate that those location quotients will be growing. And I think, oh, can I go back? There we go. Yeah, this is actually my last slide. And so recently, LADC, in collaboration with a wide group of stakeholders, developed an implementation plan for the burgeoning bioscience cluster in the LA region. Los Angeles had the reputation of essentially being flyover land for bioscience industry activity that was occurring in San Francisco and San Diego. However, there's clear indication that the local cluster is growing. A few anecdotal developments include, and you can see the LA Biomed Research Building. This is a 78,000 square foot research facility that will include an accelerator, specialized research facilities, and it is located at the UCLA Harbor Hospital. One of the things that we looked at in our bioscience industry cluster implementation plan is how the local public health care system can be an impetus for development. LA County has one of the most advanced or built out public health care systems in the nation, which with surrounding significant amount of real estate assets surrounding it. So we looked at the various hubs. Since LA is a very spread out, the LA Basin is a very spread out area. You can't have, it's unlike Boston where you can have like Cambridge could be the center of bioscience activity. Really, for that to be realistic in an area like Los Angeles, there has to be various hubs in various areas. And we looked at how the public healthcare system could kind of anchor that hub. We also see that we're seeing activity. There's a picture in the lower right-hand corner of a development called the Hatch. The Hatch is a new multi-tenant lab space under construction now and opening soon for life science companies that have essentially outgrown their incubator space. And that's significant because one of the biggest challenges in a nascent market like Los Angeles is that there's limited real estate or built out lab space for companies to move into. And as you know, it's a significant cost to build out lab space. So having these different types of space for various price points is really important for the growth of the sector in the LA region. But one of the most telling situations, and which shows that the LA bioscience sector is coming onto the map, is the fact that venture capital companies are finally beginning to formulate here. Recently, there's been a VC startup called Westlake Village Biopartners, which are former Amgen vets who have put together a $320 million fund. And that is really telling because one of the biggest challenges for the sector here in LA has always been that the VC firms were either back east or in San Francisco or San Diego, but having a VC culture here in the Los Angeles region is one of those items that we looked at as part of our collaborative when we looked at our implementation plan. In summary, building capacity in the dominant or emerging traded industry cluster provides the framework for our economic development work at LAEDC. And I'm welcoming your questions and thoughts, and thank you. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. We've been getting some questions in throughout the presentations, which I will now pose to the speakers, or both speakers. One question written in is this: our manufacturing and healthcare sectors have been clear about how automation will figure into their plans for growth, and we look to them for guidance on this topic. Are there any sectors that you feel are a little behind the curve and perhaps not as future ready or aware of what is coming? So let's just start with you, Jerry, and then we'll have Carolyn also take a cut at that one. Jerry may be on mute. There we are.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yes.
Do you want me to jump in?
Yeah, why don't you, Carolyn, go ahead and jump in and take that one. And let me just repeat the question. In a gist, it was that manufacturing and healthcare have been very good about understanding how automation will impact their plans. But are there any other sectors that you feel or that you see that seem to be a little behind the curve?
Yeah, I think when we look at automation potential by industry sector, one of the categories that's going to be impacted is educational services. And I think Gerald kind of pointed this out, that some industries have over assets. So there seems to be a significant amount of real estate associated with universities and community colleges. However, there's a growing number of students that actually are online or now, because they're part of the gig economy, can't get to these physical classes that may be in this fixed asset position. So here we have these universities and community colleges that have invested heavily in their physical assets. However, it may not meet the needs of the future workforce that needs to be mobile and taking classes in their car while they're driving. Well, they probably shouldn't be doing that, but there may need to be some correction in that particular sector as we move forward with the physical assets that you have and the classes selection and the needs for people to be more flexible as they work in the gig economy.
Am I back now?
Yep, you're back, Jerry. Thank you.
Okay. Part of the question addressed the healthcare industry, I think. And while healthcare is certainly turning to things like genetic research and proteomic research and translational medicine, personalized medicine, which do have the greater requirements, a companion piece to this is what's being called wellness and care. More and more of us baby boomers. Carolyn is entirely too young to fit this category, but I am a baby boomer. And I think as more and more of us come to the age of retirement and the need for in-home care, I think that's a growing field. It has some requirements for technology capacity, but it may be lagging some of the other industry segments. And wellness, physical wellness, and all the things that keep us out of the healthcare system as long as possible. I think that's another area where that might address the question.
Yeah, good response. Jerry, let me try another one on you. You touched on this in your presentation a little bit about how the space requirements of industry is changing from square footage per employee. How do you balance that with your real estate development community when you could see your economy booming and progressing, but creating less demand for overall space, whether it be retail or whether it's the office?
We now have we have 125 million square feet of office space in the county. 17% of it is vacant. And so the question becomes, if you're an elected official and you need the revenues in your real estate tax base, that's not the real issue for them, because somebody is paying taxes on that real estate. The problem is that unless the vacancy rates come down to a manageable level, 7, 8, 10%, then there's no new construction, so there's no incremental additions to the tax base. We have not been able to. We can't say just it's public versus private sector abilities. We can't stop the growth of office space in the county. As long as money is relatively cheap, the office space will continue to grow. The best we can do is to work harder to get it to fill it. But as you noted, it's going to be harder to fill because it takes such little space per employee. So I don't know an answer other than we just work harder to fill it.
Here's a question that has come in, and I'll let it go to either. So let's go to Carolyn first, and then Jerry. And this is a pretty simple question, but I think it deals with the issue of robotics and maybe reductions in employment demand while economies grow. But the question is this: where do you see universal basic income in the future? An easy question, right?
Absolutely. Well, universal
Carolyn,
basic.
you want to take it?
I'm sorry?
You want to go, Carolyn?
Universal basic income, I believe, if I understand the question correctly, it has been tried in the Nordic countries. Is that, you think, the question is where we're guaranteeing a basic income for all people?
Yeah, I don't want to put words in the person's mouth, but I think it has to do with if we end up with more people than we have demand because we're so productive with robots and automation, what's the role of universal basic income in that? I believe that's probably where the question is going.
Yeah, actually, let me pump that one to Gerald, see how he answers that.
Thank you very little.
Yeah. What are friends for?
As an economist, it doesn't work for me. I think it won't work for the business community. I can see establishing a basic minimum wage, which is fair to both employees and employers, but guarantees of a base income level means that employers have to pay on the basis of your existence as opposed to of what you've produced. So that's a tough question. I don't know how it works elsewhere if it's been tried, but I don't see it working well here yet.
It's probably also a little bit over the horizon. Even with us looking out into the future, 10, 15, 20 years, it could be farther than that. Here's a more current question. It said, no one mentioned the new policy direction by the federal government to protect and or resurrect U.S. manufacturing vis-a-vis using tariff walls, moving against globalism. Do you see this trend continuing, or perhaps is it a temporary blip? Any thoughts?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. This current set of tariff laws is being proposed by the current administration. If they retain enough control of the two houses of Congress in the midterm elections, you may see them pursuing it more greatly. If they don't, or if they lose in the general election in 2 years, 2.5 years, whatever it is, you may see a complete reversal of those pursuits. Problem with tariff laws is that ultimately it's the U.S. consumer who ends up paying the greater burden, because you're raising the price of global products that may otherwise be less expensive because they have to offset the cost of the tariffs. In an effort to protect U.S. industry, U.S. consumers will be absorbing those burdens. That's going to be a tough argument to push through.
I agree with Gerald. The analysis we have shown is that tariffs ultimately come back to the consumer in the form of higher costs. So it is, in the long run, I think, a difficult long-term policy.
Okay, so now we've had all the hard questions out of the way. Here's one that says, in your experience, what do you find to be the best sources of information to both track and monitor emerging technologies? Jerry, you first, and then Carolyn.
Okay. There are a number of associations and chambers of commerce built specifically around things like artificial intelligence and the new areas of biotechnological research. And we have found them to be great sources of information because they're comprised largely of those in the industry. The other thing that we've found to be successful is just to talk to our business people who are working on some of those issues, or in our case, the feds, because they're so handy, about what they're working on, what they see coming. They're always, in both cases, they're always happy to tell you what they think.
Carolyn?
Yeah, in LA, we work really closely with our trade organizations and associations such as Biocom in the biosciences. We have the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, which has regular newsletters and showcases of innovation. So we find that as we go out and talk to not only just our businesses, but our trade associations, we find out what the cutting or leading edge innovation, what cutting and leading edge innovations are occurring. We particularly we spend a great deal of time going to innovation showcases.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Carolyn, in the report itself.
Can I just add one brief thing to Carolyn's comment? My guess is that the organizations and associations in her area, as well as our areas, would be happy to talk to anybody in other areas. You don't have to stick strictly to your own region.
Well, that is very true. And happy to provide a list if people need them.
Carolyn, in the report itself, in the Future Ready report, one of the case studies in the back mentions the future forums that LA County uses. Do you find that to be a helpful tool in getting the industry clusters to kind of dialogue around the future of their own cluster?
Absolutely. We actually do our future forums here. And for example, our most recent future forum was on fintech, the innovations that are happening in the financial services. And I should also mention that we at LADC have industry councils. So we quarterly get together with the stakeholders and leading thinkers in the various industries. So for example, in biosciences, we often have Amgen and Prolacta and other institutions at these meetings, and we get to speak and talk about where these industries are moving, and particularly in our advanced transportation sector, where Proterra, BYD, and others get together and we talk about what's the advancements that are happening, what are the challenges, what's the regulatory environment. So we look at a lot of those issues in our future forums and in our quarterly industry council meetings.
Good. Here's a longer question that I think it gets to a very important issue for a lot of our economic development practitioner peers across the country, and it is the question is: do you have any rough estimates of the trickle-down time for automation technology? The questioner goes on to say, Budweiser, Amazon, Ford, CSX have the R&D capabilities to develop and implement their own technologies, or draw from DARPA. But is there a time horizon for seeing such tech in our downtowns, mom and pops, and small businesses? I think so. The question is, okay, the big guys have their own kind of future studies, but what about the trickle-down time that will affect our small business and mom and pops in our own downtowns?
Wow, that's a great question. That's a great question. I would think that as particularly restaurants and things like that, I see more and more deliveries, not always by showing up in a store. For example, I see commercials on TV for pizzas being delivered by drones, pizza being delivered by at a station where there's no employees. They just fill the box. I think that could hurt local small businesses who also make pizza or whatever. I think that's probably an area that will impact small businesses more quickly, but I can see it in all forms of retail because for the same reason.
Any thoughts on that, Carolyn?
Yeah, I was just my only thought is that the cost, there's a high level or cost to entry in with some of these technologies, and so as those costs diminish, as they did with computers over time, we'll see them adapted by the smaller mom and pop stores. But I agree, it certainly is a longer time horizon for the mom and pop stores, and they may not be able to weather the cost efficiencies of the larger Papa John's and others, like just using the pizza example, that can adapt the technology and reduce their labor costs accordingly.
I'm going to ask you both a question that I prepared myself because you both work in very successful large community, large commercial areas. And one of the questions that always comes up is, okay, but what about smaller communities who don't have all the resources? What can smaller communities do to prepare for the future, or what should they be doing to prepare for the future?
Well, if I'll go first, because I've done, as I said, I've done a lot of writing, and I've talked to over 200 mayors and chairs around the country as a preface to the research. I think that small communities have a great appeal to some individuals. Not everybody wants to live in a major city or in a major metropolitan area. And so the trick is to ensure that you have the bare minimum requirements for a given industry segment. That starts with good schools, quality workforce. If you have those things and you are working to attract the right businesses, I think that you'll find that there's an increasing, I think the pendulum has swung toward smaller areas. There's an increasing interest level in that small town feel where you know your neighbors and all those things. I think you can see it's all a matter of appealing to the right industries for which you have the right assets.
Yeah, and I just want to build upon that. Though Los Angeles County is large in size, it's actually made up of 88 smaller cities. The city of Los Angeles being the largest, but there are these smaller communities for which many industries prefer to be located because the infrastructure is there. They have the requisite education, as Gerald had pointed out. So there are ways to compete and support your industry clusters. So, for example, at the moment, out in an area called Pasadena, Monrovia, which has Caltech, if you mapped the startup company activity that's occurring, you can see that it's occurring along the light rail line, and it's actually occurring away from the center city, so for quality of life purposes. So I do think knowing your region, knowing your community, what are your assets that you bring to the table, and leveraging that of the larger megatropolis is really an approach, and also just focusing on your workforce and talent development issues, partnering with your universities and your community colleges.
Here's a question from one of the participants, and I know, Jerry, you touched a little bit on this, but I think they're getting into it more specifically. What assets will specifically attract office development in the future? And they just posed a question, 100 gig fiber. We hear a lot about bandwidth, and access to broadband. How important will that be in the future? Jerry?
I think it's absolutely vital. You cannot attract today's technology companies without sufficient fiber, and you absolutely won't be able to attract what's coming that we don't know. So yeah, I think that's critical, the fiber, but we've also talked about workforce and education systems, safe neighborhoods, quality of life. I think all of those things go in together, but it has to start with the ability for communities to do technology work and to communicate.
We talked a lot about technology and STEM and things of that, but this is, I think, a question that a lot of economic developers deal with is that how do you convince your policy leaders to take preparatory action when there's so much uncertainty about what will actually may happen or come to pass? How do you move the narrative or change the narrative from their current thinking to more future-oriented thinking?
Well, we started out 35 years ago trying to convince, and it's not an overnight challenge, but we convinced our elected officials that this was all about return on investment. And thank goodness that we exist in a community where our elected officials tend to think like business people. They fund promotion at a greater level when the economy is down, for example. So that was the first step. The second step was translating that return on investment into things that the voters could understand and appreciate. Smaller classrooms, always an issue. We need a new fire station. We need a road here. Well, we're not going to convince anybody that this is a good investment with a return if we talk about dollars. We talk about roads, we talk about school size, we talk about police and fire stations and other things that appeal to the voters. And then finally, whenever there is a successful announcement, say, or any kind of success, we make as much hay out of it as we can, because that's what voters see, the press coverage, and that it brings them to the conclusion that, okay, I can see this working.
I think we spent a significant amount of time here at LAADC in direct conversation with our elected officials, both at the county level and the local elected official level. Part of just having the dialogue, and we start always with the data. So LAADC's approach is to look at the research analysis, like with our Center for a Competitive Workforce, showing the growth of middle skill jobs. So we're looking at living wage jobs for individuals who do not necessarily need to have a 4-year degree. We try to talk about how changes in policies can lead to community benefits, which increase tax revenue to the coffers. So it's always about the dialogue, the education of all parties about how do we increase our investment to increase the prosperity for all of our residents. But it's not an easy conversation.
So here's a question, because we've been talking a lot this afternoon about future preparedness or future readiness. How would you measure or benchmark a community's future readiness?
Well, I think that depends on the industries you want to pursue. I think you start with the industries you want to pursue. It's like two columns. The first one is the industry segments you want to go after, and where do you have asset gaps? Where are you missing those things that they absolutely require in a community? And then secondly, how do you acquire them? If you can't acquire them, you can't go after them. So you either go after those industry segments for which you do have the requisite assets, or you start to collect them as you go.
Yeah,
Carolyn, I've got.
Yes, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I think he answered it. I think I completely agree.
Carolyn, I have a question for you, and I was intrigued and impressed with your comments about getting 19 community colleges to co-invest in the Center for a Competitive Workforce. One of the questions that comes up often to is addressed by economic developers from community college or academics is, well, you know, we trained a bunch of workers for this or that in the past, and then by the time we got them all set up and got trained, those jobs were gone. How did you, any insight into how you were able to pull that many disparate academic centers into agreement to co-invest in the future?
And that's a really good question, and I wish we could take complete credit for it, but the reality is that when the state of California put together a program called Strong Workforce, by definition, it distributed the funds based on the ability for regions to collaborate. So we looked at the regional community college system broken out by the LA County, Orange County, and because it was based on these regions, the LA County and the Orange County Regional Consortium already existed. It's a group of 27 community colleges. So to be honest with you, it took us over a year of intense conversations about how we would develop this entity and what the goals were. And it was really important. It wasn't just our economic development practitioners in the room, it was industry. One of the big components here is that really what we're saying is we need industry-driven curriculum, not curriculum based on how many people we can get in a seat, but how many people we can get into a job. And by that being the directive at the state level, it helped us in our negotiations considerably, but it's always a challenge.
I also think that community colleges will become increasingly important in the future. I think you can acquire the skill sets that business needs in 2-year certificates or degrees much more directly in the future than we have been able to in the past.
Yeah, a few years ago, when I was running the research park in North Carolina, we had a need for bioscience technology workers, not the PhD, not the chemists and the scientists, but bench, technicians. And our community colleges were able to put together a program to provide those. And interestingly enough, almost all the people that went into those programs already had their bachelor's degree. And they were going back to get the, kind of bench chemistry support so they could move into the bioscience jobs and get into kind of new jobs of the future. Very, very much along that line. I agree with your point about the community colleges. Here's one that is, here's a softball question for both of you. How do you enable your staff or support your team so they can stay abreast of all this change in the face of the demands of their day-to-day work?
Well,
go ahead, sure.
No, please go ahead.
At LADC, I think I've initially stated that we are structured around our industry clusters. So we have in our industry cluster development team individuals who already have a base in digital media and entertainment, biosciences, and through our industry council. So part of what we do, we're in constant conversations with our trade organizations, with our industry councils, and we try as best as we can to send staff to key conferences to make sure that we understand the cutting edge information. But it really is centrally located around the fact that we've brought in individuals who already have a strong foundation in those industry clusters.
Yeah, I have a similar answer, Carolyn. Our marketing managers are also assigned or come from industry segments, and so they're assigned those industry segments as well as geographic assignments. But they're given a set of expectations in the beginning of the year, and their directors have budgets for these things. And I don't want to tell one of our marketing managers just because they're in cybersecurity they should go to this conference. Neither do I want them having to come to me and say, can I go? So they're assigned to an industry segment, and it's up to them to figure out how to reach their numbers. And if that means going to industry shows or to talking to businesses, then so be it.
Good response. Jerry, I'll come back to you on this question. You made a comment in your presentation that regarding the shortage of IT workers. And you said it's not a matter of attracting them from other regions because they don't have them either, so you really have to try to find a way to grow your own. What about the areas around a hot job market, like let's just say Northern Virginia, where if a community really invests in training IT workers, the data shows a lot of those workers get them a bus ticket and get on up to Northern Virginia where they can go to work in your area in that, and you get the question of, wait a minute, we're just training someone else's workers. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's the very reason that we have not tried to promote the job market here to individuals, because there's no, for two reasons, honestly. We don't want to steal from somebody else who has the same demand, but also it would be a drop in the bucket. Frankly, we have 200,000 IT vacancies in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area right now. And so if we could attract 20 from here and 50 from there, we still have 199,000 and whatever. So what we need to do, and this is not an overnight answer to this, but we need to incorporate all the colleges, the community colleges, even the high schools, get them involved in producing. I mean, this is a 5 to 10 year window on this, but we need to get them out there to help fuel this from our local sources. Good
response. Carolyn, let me address this question to you, because we've been talking about technology and good jobs and better jobs and advanced clusters and competitive advantage, but in a county as large as LA County, you have not just a two-tiered, you probably have a multi-layered, if you will, workforce with at the same time need for advanced technology workers. In the future, you need to be able to fill probably tremendous amount of entry-level or middle skills or lower skill workers. How do you balance? How does a county balance the relative tug and pull between those different demographic and occupational sectors?
Yeah, we have, and you're absolutely right, one of the fastest growing segments in terms of employment is in the food services, which is, as you know, lower wage positions, but nonetheless an opportunity for job placement. Within the county has their workforce investment boards that the county of Los Angeles, which is very large, is segmented into 7 workforce investment board areas, and I think they're called WIOAs now, actually, which deals with looking at individuals and placing individuals with middle skill or less skills into jobs, and working with the adult education system. We have our workforce development councils where we try to look at the entire spectrum of workforce needs. While in my presentation, we focused on middle skills because that at the moment is where our Center for Competitive Workforce Research is focusing, we are working across the board with our adult education, with our workforce investment boards, and quite frankly, looking even at K through 12 in LA Unified School District to look at developing the skills that are needed for entry-level positions at all the points along that spectrum.
Another question from one of our participants has just come in, and it says one of the trends mentioned, for example, is the changing nature of work from traditional long-term jobs to more short-term and/or contractors, or the 1099 workforce. How does this impact what services an EDO would provide?
The changing nature of the workforce?
Yeah, a move from towards more 1099. That's, I guess, it's getting into the gig economy of some sort.
Well, it's one man's problem is another man's opportunity. I think as companies are now, as individuals are now increasingly going to have to find their own health insurance and retirement plans and so forth. I see a growth in the industry providing health insurance and providing for individuals and small businesses, and growth in areas like providing not only insurance but pension plans or individual retirement plans. But I also see one of the trends that in the younger part of the workforce right now is a lack of interest in owning a car, which means that they either need to live near public transportation or within easy access of their employer, or their employer isn't going to be able to get to bring them in. So I see that as one of the things that's changing not only the nature of work, but nature of our communities.
Interesting. Here's a bit of a follow-up question. Talking about is there an ideal age demographic profile in mind? And this individual is talking about their community. Said we're losing the age group of 25 to 49 and gaining the 65 plus age group, and we're wondering how we're going to develop the automation-ready workforce. That's a challenge for a lot of communities. Any thoughts, either Jerry or Carolyn?
Well, we have a little bit of an advantage here because the Pentagon is right next door, and we have a lot of people mustering out of military service who are in those let's call it more mature age groups, and who have extraordinary, or at least exceptional, technology skills. And so if part of the question assumes that if part of the question is whether or not you want all these young workers with new technology skills, and that's your focus, I would argue that what you really need is a good balance. You need the older people who have been there, done that, seen it twice, know how to act, and have some technology skills as well as the younger people who have the new technology skills. And I would remind everybody that a 21-year-old or a 22-year-old with current technology skills will be out of date when he's 20 or she is 23.
Ouch, but you're right.
Yep.
Yeah. Interesting question. One final question for both of you, and this will be a good one to close on as I'm sitting here looking out the window watching the remnants of Hurricane Michael kind of come across Hampton Roads. What's the economic developer's role in supporting resiliency for your community, specifically as it relates to issues around climate change? We'll end on an easy one, right?
Well, let me just say, at LADC, one of the areas that we work with our firms and companies with is disaster preparedness. Here, whether it's earthquakes or whatever the disaster may be, but in helping companies think through how they can have contingency plans. Water is again a major issue for Los Angeles and California, and we are actually in the process of thinking about developing a whole industry cluster around water conservancy and water issues here at LADC, because it's an area for which it's going to be an increasing challenge over the next 20 years. So we are formulating the analytics so that we can better be prepared to have programs in place that address both those issues, both the disaster and the water issues.
That's interesting. I think our businesses approach this, excuse me, from a different angle, because so many of them are federal contractors, and so they're working with whatever federal agencies, plural, are looking at climate change and how you prepare for it, how you react to it. Other than that, we don't have climate change really. The only, climate change for us isn't weather-based, it's politically based. So climate, if we have a new administration in town in 2 years, everybody moves in, everybody moves out. We have people looking for work. We have new people come into town to work on the Hill. That's our climate change.
Well, that could be a subject of a whole other webinar, Jerry. I'm sure we could talk the rest of the afternoon on that. What a treat we've had today with our two panelists in this webinar. That really concludes all the time that we have. I want to really take a minute to thank Jerry Gordon and Carolyn Hull for their wonderful presentation and their spirited dialogue back and forth during the Q&A. I want to thank each and every one of our participants for signing on with us, and remind everybody that within 24 hours you'll be getting a survey or an evaluation that'll be emailed to you by IADC. Please complete the evaluation, as we do use that important feedback to improve these webinars. At the end of the evaluation, you'll get a link to the download of today's presentations, and also a link to download your free copy of the Economic Development Research Partners Future Ready Report at the end of the survey. On the screen, you'll see the next one of our Future Ready webinars is coming up from every day on Thursdays from October 11 to November 8, from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm Rick Weddle. I'm signing out. I've enjoyed being with you today. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.